Welcome back to our afternoon session. We'll be starting our third session with a paper from Professor Antoine Borrut, who is Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Maryland. He's the author of the book Entre mémoire et pouvoir, l'espace syrien sous les derniers Umayyad et les premiers Abbasides, which was published by Brill in 2011, and which won the Islamic Republic of Iran World Book Award in the Islamic History section, which I believe Stephanie's book also won. And also, like Stephanie, he was awarded the Syrian Studies Association Best Book Prize. In choosing the participants for this conference, we looked at the list of people who've won the Syrian Studies Association Best Book Prize. In addition to that single-authored monograph, he's also edited 4 volumes with Fred Donner, Christians and Others in the Umayyad State, which came out from Chicago in 2016, with Debier, Papa Constantino, Pieri et Sodini. He edited a book called Le Proche-Orient de Justinien aux Abbasides, Peuplement et Dynamique Spatiale, with Brepols in 2012, and a volume called Écriture et de l'histoire et processus de canonisation dans les premiers siècles de l'Islam, which was a special issue of the Revue des mondes musulmans et de la Méditerranée in 2011. He also co-edited with Paul Cobb a book that I really love, Umayyad Legacies, Medieval Memories from Syria to Spain, which was published with Brill in 2010, and which looks at the connections between the Umayyad dynasties of Damascus and Cordoba. He has been a Patricia Crona member of the Institute for Advanced Study at the School of Historical Studies at Princeton. In 2016-2017, he's also served as invited professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and he serves as the co-editor of Al-Usul al-Wusta, the Journal of Middle East Medievalists. He's served in that capacity since 2011. Today, Antoine will be talking about negotiating cultural continuity in early Islam, the future of ancient knowledge. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you, Abby, and thanks to Peter for organizing this wonderful workshop and forcing us to think out of the box about questions that are not, maybe standard for us as Islamicists. So let me start. Well, as you will see, I probably still have 2 papers into one, so you're going to suffer with me, and hopefully it will connect them at the end. But let me start by talking about history of science, and then I'll broaden the discussion to the Umayyad worldview. So history of science in early Islam, and then the Umayyad worldview. And I'll start with a couple of anecdotes dealing with the transmission of scientific knowledge in the formative period of Islam. Both stories bear witness to the collection and preservation of ancient foreign objects and texts, and are therefore potentially reflective of an antiquarian desire. I am particularly interested in the questions they raise with regard to the construction of cultural continuity in early Islam and how such processes have been memorialized in medieval sources. The first narrative comes from the anonymous Book of Gifts and Rarities, Kitab al-Hadaya wal-Tuhaf. We've heard a companion volume cited by Stefan earlier. This one is likely an 11th century text preserved in a 15th century copy by Ibn Dukmak. And it states that the king of China once wrote to the Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah, quote, "Now I have sent you a gift, which is not merely a gift, but rather a rarity, tuhfa." The authors then specify that, quote again, the gift was a book concerning the secrets of their sciences. It is said that the book came later to Khalid bin Yazid bin Muawiyah, an Umayyad prince, I'm going to talk about more later, who used it for great alchemical experiments and other things. And the second story is preserved by Ibn al-Kifti, who reports that the scholar, not well known by, in fact, Ibn al-Sinbadi, was in Cairo in 1044, where he saw in the Fatimid library a bronze globe of the heavens. the globe ascribed to Ptolemy was bearing an inscription attesting that it once belonged to the same Umayyad prince, Khalid bin Yazid bin Muawiyah, who died around 704. So in both cases, we are dealing with the transmission of precious foreign objects, focusing on astrology and alchemy, connected to the Umayyad prince Khalid bin Yazid, and carefully preserved over time. Such anecdotes are often quickly dismissed in modern scholarship for various reasons. Attributions to figures such as Ptolemy or Tang king are regarded as fanciful. Khalid bin Yazid's scientific achievements have been discarded as basically legendary, as we shall see below. And early textual transmissions have been rejected under the assumption that no such scientific life took place under the Umayyad dynasty. All these elements have concurred to treat such anecdotal evidence as literary topoi at best. So what I would like to do in this paper is to question the significance of such traditions, notably from a perspective of history of meanings, Sinngeschichte, and history of memory. What is at stake is to shed light on how the Umayyads approached the past and situated themselves as heirs to earlier imperial cultural and scientific traditions, how, more broadly, they negotiated cultural continuity in the context of the construction of the caliphate and of a world empire stretching from the Indian subcontinent to modern-day France, and finally how these Umayyad efforts, real or imagined, were remembered by subsequent generations. Let's begin with the question of the transmission of scientific knowledge in order to contrast modern scholarly discourses with medieval memories before broadening the discussion to the Umayyad worldview itself. For the future of ancient knowledge, and ancient scientific knowledge in particular, modern scholarship mostly credits the Abbasids and or the Abbasid period for developing links towards earlier scholarly traditions. This is extremely clear when one looks, for instance, at the grand narrative of history of science and at the so-called translation movement in particular, at least as it has been usually conceived until Saliba challenged Guttes's chronology. You have both books on the slide. Guttes's assumption is that the translation movement, quote, began with the accession of the Abbasids to power and took place primarily in Baghdad. This view was challenged by Saliba, who argued that the early Abbasid era could not mark a beginning because preconditions were required for such a scientific boom to occur. In particular, the translation of difficult philosophical or scientific works necessitated a pre-existing milieu of scholars acting not only as gifted philologists, but also conversant with the specificities and technicalities of the relevant scholarly fields. Saliba posits that the Arabization of the Diwan and of the administration under Abd al-Malik, a very large question that I'm not addressing here, in the late 7th century, provided such an impetus. And yet the notion of an Abbasid-era construction of cultural continuity is in fact much more widespread and pervasive, and by no means restricted to history of science. Consider, for instance, the Abbasid construction of the Jahiliyyah, discussed by Drury and more recently by Peter Webb, or the integration of non-Arab traditions and non-Arab pasts, thinking of Sarah's work on Iran, and how this was integrated into universal histories. The Abbasid cultural edifice is further buttressed by the compilation of Arab genealogies, of hadith corpora, of the seerah, of Arabic grammar, of the historiographical tradition. I could go on. Prior to the rise of the Abbasids, the Umayyads are often reduced to a mere case of Byzance après Byzance, to paraphrase the late Irfan Shahid, and the period is seen as being of limited cultural significance. The Umayyad century is perceived as the age of a gap of narrative sources, and the intellectual and cultural achievements of the dynasty, or alleged lack thereof, have regularly generated harsh criticism. Thus, in the early 20th century, the Umayyads were seen as, quote, a blow to the progress of knowledge. Much more recently, the chapter dedicated to science, to the sciences in Islamic societies in the new Cambridge History of Islam, skips the Umayyad period altogether. The chapter is the Science in Islamic Societies, 750 to 1800. David Pingree, leading scholar of history of science, claimed in the late 1990s that, quote, astrology in Islam, like many other sciences, began in the late 8th century, that is in Abbasid times, as an amalgam of the Hellenistic traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, Iran, and India. Even more recently, another scholar claimed that in the history of astronomy, we have to face the problem of a dark century in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. From the middle of the 7th century to the middle of the 8th century, there are no traces of any kind of activities in the field of mathematical astronomy. Here again, I could go on. Such views are quite paradoxical at a time when recent scholarship has done much to rehabilitate the Umayyad memory and the role of the first dynasty of Islam in the construction of an Islamic identity, of a visual culture, and of a rich corpus of poetry celebrated across the centuries, to name but a few. The Umayyad prejudice, in fact, and especially with regard to scientific knowledge, has deeper roots. It is connected to the overall picture of the Arabs and of the Arabian Peninsula in particular, that was allegedly disconnected from late antique cultural and scientific trends. To put it simply, modern scholarship has embraced, and sometimes constructed, a discourse that restricts scientific continuity to the Abbasid period. The future of ancient scientific knowledge was, somehow, deferred to cosmopolitan Baghdad. Now, the anecdotes offered in preamble offer a good illustration of the problem. The Umayyad prince Khalid bin Yazid has been anathematized in several steps in modern scholarship. It is primarily his association to alchemy that drew fire, even if the sources commonly underline his interest in astrology, medicine, and other fields. After a first salvo fired by Ruska in the 1920s, Ullmann led the definitive charge, concluding that Khalid's interest and practice in alchemy was a mere legend, elaborated at a much later stage. Ullmann indeed totally rejected the possibility of Khalid's involvement in alchemy or any other scientific field for that matter. In the interest of time, I'll spare you the minutiae required to deconstruct the so-called Ullmann thesis. Suffice it to say that, in order to condemn Khalid, Ullmann had to reject a tantalizing amount of material supporting Khalid's scientific knowledge and to ignore texts that are earlier or contemporary to what Ullmann believed represented the initial layers in the transmission process. Indeed, a wealth of Arabic texts emphasize Khalid's intellect and his appetite for alchemy, astrology, medicine, and more. Basically, no Arabic writer except Ibn Khaldun had anything except words of praise for Khalid. Ibn Khaldun likewise considers that scientific developments are post-Umayyad. To give you just a few examples, Al-Jahiz claimed that Khalid was the first to have books of astrology, medicine, and alchemy translated into Arabic. This view finds a large echo in the sources, and Ibn al-Nadim report that when Khalid got interested into alchemy, he summoned a group of Greek philosophers from Egypt who were fluent in Arabic. He then ordered them to translate the books about alchemy from Greek and Coptic into Arabic. Like Jahiz, Ibn al-Nadim claims that those were the first translation into Arabic. I leave that aside. Other sources, later sources, stress that Khalid was also adept at collecting books and that he purchased countless books from Byzantium and brought them to Syria. Some of Khalid's own writings seem to have remained accessible for centuries. Ibn al-Nadim thus claims that Khalid composed a substantial body of poetry on alchemy, and he says that he saw it himself, and he saw in particular about 500 leaves of poetry, he claims in the Fihrist. So that suggests that an impressive corpus was being attributed to Khalid in the 10th century Baghdad. In a manuscript preserved in Ankara and one studied by Rosenthal, we find a list of all Arabic books on astrology, quote, found in the libraries of kings and in the possession of great men, end quote, apparently reflecting the situation of the 9th century. And the list notably includes a book of Theophilus, that's the famous Theophilus of Edessa, and a book by Khalid al-Umawi, that's our guy, Khalid bin Yazid. So on top of these abundant textual evidences, the anecdotes preserved by Ibn al-Kifti and cited at the beginning of this paper about the celestial globe, globe of the heaven, suggest the survival of material elements as well. If the ascription of the globe of heaven spotted in the Fatimid library to Ptolemy can legitimately be questioned. Though we should note that the symbolic attribution is just as meaningful and consistent with the Arabic translations of the Almagest, crediting Ptolemy with such artifacts. The inscription bearing the name of Khalid is harder to explain away. What would have been the rationale for the Fatimids to forge it? And even if they or someone else did, it showed that by the 11th century, Khalid had become a central figure to assert the cultural continuity of astrological knowledge. The fact that the globe is kept in the library possibly suggests that it belonged to a collection, thus revealing antiquarian practices. And yet, the rejection of Umayyad-era scientific activity remains the norm in modern scholarship. Despite Saliba's important work, medieval sources are telling different stories that usually emphasize, or often emphasize, the significance of the Umayyad moment. We shouldn't too quickly dismiss the voluminous amount of medieval texts crediting the Umayyads on that front, thus building a discourse of cultural continuity at odds with modern scholarship. There are certainly good reasons to reevaluate the role of Khalid and of Umayyad-era intellectual life more broadly. Consider, for instance, that alchemy should be understood as the indispensable companion to Abd al-Malik's coinage reform, that astrology was one of the most successful cultural systems in human history, and that we have a significant amount of evidence for its cultivation under the Umayyads. On top of the many mentions of astrologers advising caliphs or practicing at the court, we can think, for instance, of the zodiac of Qusay Amra that you see on the slide. Interestingly enough, this zodiac has been traced to Greek models. We have Greek manuscripts that we're not sure which one in particular, but we know that itself, this zodiac itself betrays some kind of an antiquarian interest in Greek manuscripts. We also have, among other things, lists of Umayyad-era horoscopes, such as the one preserved on these manuscripts by Al-Sijzi, preserved in Paris. Again, should we count this as antiquarianism? It's a list of old horoscopes, and it's compiled, I forgot some, I should have given you the date, Al-Sijzi died 1020, so it's an 11th century list. So, the continuity of alchemy and astrology was asserted through the mediation of the Umayyads in Abbasid times. Khalid's role as a cultural broker, collecting and passing on ancient knowledge, is not unprecedented, nor is it isolated. The Umayyads were themselves confronted to pre-existing constructions of cultural continuity and obviously had their own claims to make. If some of the Khalid stories point to Egypt, remember the translation of books I mentioned earlier, competing narratives existed in the Umayyad realm. At some point, astrology was thought to derive from a Chinese book sent to Muawiyah as a diplomatic gift, as noted is one of my opening anecdotes. If we move further east, in Samarkand, the Afrasiab paintings, or so-called ambassadors painting, commissioned most likely around 650 or 660 by the Sogdian king Varhuman, offer yet another narrative. To the left, how do I get the pointer? To the left, here, of the eastern wall, you have a drawing that might be a bit clearer to read here. A scene depicts two individuals facing each other with a spherical object in between them. Franz Grenet recently interpreted this painting as a Greek scholar, that will be the figure here to the left, good luck with that, transmitting astrological knowledge to an Indian man to the right, and you can see an armillary sphere in between them. The association between India and learning was so well established that at this period that some Arab observers attributed the ultimate sources of Greek learning to India. Astrology, therefore, reveals the impressive spectrum of cultural interactions and exchanges across Eurasia. Much more was at stake for the Umayyads, however, to assert cultural continuity in an age of conquests. The question is indeed not restricted to scientific knowledge and the circulation of books and manuscripts under the Umayyads. As world conquerors, the masters of Damascus were constantly confronted to imperial memories and the glories of past civilization. So let's broaden the scope a bit and think about what I have termed, following Professor Schnapp's title, the Umayyad conquest of the past. I don't know why it was translated as the discovery of the past in English, but the French title is La Conquête du Passé. The Umayyads did not only conquer vast territorial expanses. They also had to conquer the past of regions with long imperial and cultural traditions. To put it differently, can you be a world conqueror without embracing antiquarianism? Sources abound with narratives of battles providing formidable riches and spoils, together with subsequent discoveries and confiscations of past dynasties' treasures. Seizing valuable artifacts from past dynasty was not the end of the story, though. Al-Wasiti, writing in the early 11th century, reports the narration of a servant, Khadim, appointed to the upkeep of the Dome of the Rock under the Umayyads. During the time of Abd al-Malik, there was hanging on the chain above the rock, under the dome, the Yatima pearl, the horns of Abraham's ram, and the crown of Kisra, the Sasanian emperor. When the Abbasids took over the caliphate, they sent them those artifacts to the Kaaba in Mecca, we are told. This tradition seems to go back to the 9th century, but the pattern of sending regalia and precious objects to sacred monuments is confirmed with respect to Mecca by several independent sources, including the near-contemporary Syriac chronicle of Theophilus of Edessa, briefly mentioned earlier, died around 785, as reconstructed from later citations. He tells us that after the capture of Marv, the conquerors, quote, took the royal crown of the Persians and sent it to Osman. The latter placed it in the place of prayer, the Kaaba, which they call the Kaaba, where it is until today. As noted by Alain Georges, who recently studied this anecdote, crowns and other previous objects and spoils of war continued to be sent to Mecca in subsequent decades. Whether the crown and the horns of the Dome of the Rock were different from those in Mecca or were taken to Jerusalem upon Abd al-Malik's victory over the Zubayrids in 692 cannot be determined. But the nature of the source and the ubiquity of the practice make it entirely plausible that such objects did exist at the Dome of the Rock in the Umayyad period, concludes Georges. Temples, after all, had long functioned as storehouses of ancient objects in the Near East in the very longue durée. Now, such strategies could prove dangerously deceptive, and ancient objects remain reminiscent of the long-lasting memory of past empires. Thus, we are told that the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun obtained in Khorasan a large gold brazier, Kanun, studded with precious stones too numerous to be evaluated. It is said that it belonged to the Persian king Yazdegerd. Al-Fadl bin Sahl, vizier to the caliph, said, "Commander of the faithful, I suggest that you place it in the Kaaba and burn aloes wood in it night and day." Can you feel the trap here? Can you anticipate it? Al-Ma'mun said, "So shall I," and ordered it to be carried to Mecca. As the story started to circulate in Mecca, the anecdote continues, a local scholar opposed it and rejected the idea that Al-Ma'mun had actually wanted to turn the Kaaba into a fire temple. That's what happened if you burn fire constantly in it. And so the head of intelligence, Ashab al-Barid, subsequently informed the caliph, who had the brazier destroyed and smashed into pieces, so the plot of Al-Fadl was revealed. In other instances, the past could simply not be domesticated at all. Certain artifacts from the conquest were indeed not acceptable for domestic consumption within the Islamic realm, but could still be profitable. Thus, Al-Baladhri reports that Muawiyah dispatched to Sindh, to India, Pakistan and India in modern terms, idols seized during the Arab conquest of Sicily with the certainty that they would find a market there. But except in such extreme circumstances, where idols were shipped to Sindh or artifacts were destroyed, most of the content of Umayyad treasuries eventually ended up in the hands of their successors, the Abbasids. The Umayyads thus had an essential role to play in preserving ancient knowledge and antique objects for future generations. Now, the future of Umayyad collections is captured in various anecdotes. One of them, already mentioned by Stefan this morning, so we're at this point of the workshop, we're going to just repeat ourselves indefinitely, report that, quote, when Marwan bin Muhammad, the last Umayyad caliph, when he was captured in Egypt, the Abbasids found in his treasures an onyx table with a wild background and black and red stripes. It was 3 spans wide, 2 fingers thick, and had gold legs. This is the part you've heard now. There was also a goblet of pharaonic glass, 1 finger thick and 1.5 spans wide, with an image in high relief representing a lion and a man kneeling before it, fixing an arrow onto his bow. The 2 objects remained in the treasuries until the reign of Al-Ma'mun, who presented both of them, along with other things, to the king of India. The table, we are even told, was made in the form of the sign of Jupiter, and he who ate on it will never become overly full. We'll come back to Stephanie's typology later, don't worry. The Umayyads thus preserved ancient objects so the Abbasids could redistribute them as wondrous gifts once the past had been domesticated. Elsewhere we are told about a precious mirror that allegedly belonged to Adam, or about a lavishly decorated mechanical she-camel that passed from India to the Umayyads and eventually to the Abbasids. I could go on. So the number of anecdotes is endless. But and these Umayyad collections, eventually confiscated by the Abbasids, were closely connected to a sustained caliphal interest in the past. Indeed, we are told that caliphs such as Muawiyah and Hisham in particular were extremely avid learners of past history. Al-Mas'udi famously reports in his Golden Meadows that, quote, Muawiyah devoted a third of the night to the history of the Arabs and their famous battles, the histories of foreign peoples, their kings and their governments, the biographies of monarchs, including their wars and stratagems, and methods of rule and other matters connected with ancient history. After sleeping the second third of the night, looks like an academic to me, the caliph had pages, royal librarians and readers maybe, bring him books in which were biographies of kings and accounts of their battles and tactics, which they read to Muawiyah. On top of the pre-Islamic Arabian past, the history of Iran also emerges as another central topic of interest, as evidenced by another report by Al-Mas'udi, who says that he saw in 915 at Istakhr in Iran a valuable book on the sciences of the Persians and the history of their kings, which had belonged to the royal library, and it was taken, says Mas'udi, during the Arab conquest, and in 113 of the Hijrah, that's 731-32, it was translated for Hisham bin Abd al-Malik. And Mas'udi says that he used the book as a source for his own report on Persian history. So we can obviously debate the value and reality of each individual anecdote. Taken together, though, they speak volume to the efforts of later generations to cultivate an Umayyad memory in relation to the preservation of past objects and texts. And we have another kind of evidence to support the idea that the Caliph of Damascus indeed developed new links toward the past and could make their own claims in the great scheme of imperial succession. I think we started a bit late now, so I still have a few minutes.